Thanks so much, Macy, for sharing. Next, we'll have Pep. Over to you.
Thank you, Ryan. You're going to put my slides up, please? Thank you. So I'm going to try and make this a little bit more sort of fast-paced. But I thought it was important to maybe provide a little bit of context to who Wilmar International or what Wilmar International is as a company. We're basically in over 32 countries, and we're really more of a manufacturing company now. And in fact, we do more processing and trading side of the business as compared to plantations. But what we are known for and what we are generally called out for publicly tend to be about our palm oil operations, which are primarily in Indonesia and Malaysia, but also in West Africa. So we have operations as well in Ghana and Nigeria. So that's the kind of yellow, sort of the blue highlight there around Indonesia and Malaysia, which really is to highlight in general that we have about 300,000 hectares of plantation. So we're not the world's biggest by any stretch. We're probably like number 8 globally in terms of plantation. But because we process a lot of palm, we are often equated to the palm industry. So I think the what I'm going to present today really is a view on what Wilmar has done since 2015 to really look at how we sort of minimize the impacts of fires, but also how we've approached the monitoring. So it's good actually to be sort of following on from Macy's presentation, because this really is highlighting a little bit more about what private sector is currently doing. If we go to the next slide, please. It's important to highlight that it's in Indonesia, the context is very specific about fires. And I think the first is that it is not technically illegal to use fire in Indonesia in agriculture. It's illegal to use it if you are an agriculture company. And the penalties for that is really quite huge. It's 10 billion Indonesian rupiah fine and jail time. So that's the equivalent of about $1 million Singapore dollars. So it's really quite major. And so really the point of this is to illustrate the fact that while agrarian law makes it very clear that if you are a palm company, and that even means if you are a medium or a small palm company, if you were to be found guilty of using fire, you're going to be fined this massive amount of money, but also jail time. And that has been done really quite strictly by the Indonesian government. So the problem here is that it is not the big companies, it is not in fact the plantation companies that are doing this. And if you look at the figure 1 here, which I think you can see, sort of the large gray piece here, this is data from World Resource Institute. The vast majority of the fires that occur in Indonesia on an annual basis, but particularly within the drier years, is happening outside of concessions, outside of either pulpwood or oil palm plantations, or even outside of logging areas. So these are happening really effectively in farmland, village land, small scale crops like paddy, etc. So I think it's that context that we need to look at this with that lens, because in these areas outside of agrarian law, it is really vested within local authority at district level or bupati level to allow fire use. And this is something that is very much enshrined in the culture of farmers. And it's something that's shared really throughout Southeast Asia. I myself am originally from Sabah. I'm a Kadazan. My family have planted paddy for many, many years. And before it was made illegal in Malaysia, what our family would do is once we've done the harvest, we would burn, because that's the easiest way and it's the traditional way to do it. You would burn the paddy, not the paddy, sorry, you would burn the stalks and clear the land. And that is something that for many farmers in Southeast Asia and also in Indonesia, that is a traditional way of working your land. The law does stipulate that it's for anything with 2 hectares and below. So you can imagine this is really where the problems are with the traditional use of, I think the terminology that Meiji used was sort of slash and burn. Now slash and burn Anthropologists would say perhaps the more better way to say it would be shifting cultivation, where you kind of, you plant and then you move. Slash and burn does have connotations, but it really isn't something that is done within the plantation sectors. So I think that is the one key thing to point out. The other thing is really there is a very clear difference between what is a hotspot and what is a fire. A hotspot is an area where you have an elevated temperature, and that is really articulated really quite interestingly in figure 2, where you can see where we looked at what was being mapped out as hotspots in Indonesia in the second half of last year, and you can see that it's basically the whole country is almost a hotspot, right? So the point here is that you may have an occurrence of many hotspots, but in order to qualify whether they are actually fires, you got to verify this on the ground. So there's additional verification there. And so it's important, I think, when we look at the reporting, looking at hotspots alone is not sufficient to say what were the impacts of fires. You really need to look at, were you able to confirm fires? So I think the context here is very important, because this is where, there were a lot of pre-questions that came in prior to this event about, why do farmers still use it? And it is very much a culture thing. It's a farm thing, but also, it's not inherently illegal if you are a farmer. And I'll illustrate this with the kind of classic example of Malaysians crossing the border into Singapore. When you're on the Malaysian side, you may be in your car, you're eating an apple, and you say, okay, I don't really want to stink up my car. I'm not going to drop my apple core in my car. I'm just going to throw it out the window. And in Malaysia, happens quite often. Won't point any fingers, but I think it's fairly common to litter or throw rubbish away in a manner that is not sort of responsible, right? And people do it because they know that it's not illegal to be littering. But the moment you cross the causeway into Singapore, what happens to that apple core if it's in the car, right? No way is any Malaysian or anyone crossing into Singapore going to roll down the window and throw it out, right? Because one, you're very likely to get caught. Number two, you're very likely to basically be penalized for it, because it's illegal to be littering in Singapore. And that is really the same view that we need to take on this. Why do we have a large occurrence of fires by farmers in Indonesia? It's because it is technically not illegal to be doing it. And you can compare this with Malaysia as well. I mean, anyone who's been on a flight that's landing at night during harvest season, you can see some fields on the Malaysian side alight, and that's because farmers are taking a chance to do this late at night. But it's not prevalent, as in it's not overarching, because people are aware that if they get caught, it's also a fine, it's also illegal, which is why you don't have the same numbers that you have in Indonesia with farmers just burning. So I think this is something also to bear in mind, that there is a question of legality that is not necessarily covered for outside of agrarian areas. Next slide, please. And so I think the one thing to focus on when we're talking about fire prevention, as a company, is you really need to look at what's outside your operational areas. It's not going to be enough to just focus on, okay, I've got my boundaries. We have very strong policies against the use of fire within our operations. It's not enough to do that. It is really important to focus on who is near you, your neighbors, who is sort of in your sort of immediate risk area, as it were, and to work with them. And so this really was something that was launched in 2016. And Wilmar was a founding member of the Free Fire Alliance. I believe PM Haze is as well. And what the Free Fire Alliance does is really to look at expanding that responsibility on fire prevention beyond the operational area by 5 kilometers. And so that means you're really starting to focus on working with the communities or other sort of people that are within sort of your 5 kilometer area, to ensure that they understand that you're able to socialize the concept of moving away from the use of fire into something that's perhaps more sustainable and less prone to potential risks. And I think I do want to illustrate this, I think, for the Singaporean audience. 5 kilometers may sound kind of small, but to illustrate it, if you think about the Botanic Gardens in Singapore, the Nassim Gate, right, on Nassim Road, right, 5 kilometers from the Nassim Gate is basically all the way to Chimes, right, and that's going via Nassim Road and Orchard Road. So if you think of if the Botanic Gardens, Singapore Botanic Gardens was within the Free Fire Alliance, what they would be doing is they'd be also needing to monitor what happens from Nassim Gate all the way to Chimes. That's quite a big area. The other side of the Botanic Gardens, from the Botanic Gardens MRT, which is on Bukit Timah Road, that's 5 kilometers is basically all the way up to Bukit Timah Reserve, right? And within that area, that 5 kilometer area, you also have various golf courses here and there. So it's a massive area. So it does suddenly, the expanse of responsibility for a company becomes bigger, but that's fine because ultimately what you're trying to do is reduce the risk here, and the risk is coming from external communities, right? But you need to be able to work with them. What's the incentive? The incentive is to say, by removing the risk of fire, if you move to something that's better, you're not going to have a problem. You're reducing the potential for haze, you're having a sort of healthier lifestyle, and over a longer period, it is a better way to grow crops because you're not going to have the problem of ashing on the soil, and that you have a better chance of the soil kind of rejuvenating in between cycles. So this concept I think is really critical, and sort of being able to work with the communities around there. So just to sort of give an illustration of what we've done. So 2016, we've worked with 290 villages. So we've done socializing programs with 290 villages. And we've actually signed agreements or MOUs with 54 communities in 5 regions where we operate. So in Northwest and South Sumatra, Central and West Kalimantan. And these MOUs do talk about, so one is basically we're creating sort of fire risk programs. We're basically creating the capability of putting fires out, basically creating sort of a fire brigade within that system, but also incentivizing the communities to help us be sort of the eyes and ears of fire prevention. And with that, there comes certain incentives that are being paid out, whether it's to talk about, we're giving uniforms, or sort of it's a motorcycle, but what the community themselves find that they need. And just to be clear, these communities are not necessarily smallholder palm farmers. These guys plant paddy, they plant tapioca, many other things. So they're not necessarily smallholder suppliers to Wilmar. So when we talk about incentives, we have to be really careful about not assuming that incentives just mean, does it mean a premium? Does it mean we have to incentivize that? Because you're really looking at basically changing culture, changing the way that people perceive how they can use fire. And within the FFA, the goal is therefore to reduce the average incidences of fires. Now, since then, and if we can move to the next slide, please. So we've in Wilmar, we've managed to do that. And just to sort of illustrate, I think the graph at the bottom, I think if you compare 2015 to 2019, so I think the thing to highlight here is the sort of green one at the top that indicates the rainfall, the annual rainfall for that year. So if you look at 2015 and 2019, they were really quite similar. So we're really comparing those 2 years. But if you look at what the difference is, so in 2015, we really suffered. We had about, more than 450 fires, confirmed fires within our operations. And that kind of affected more than 2,000 hectares within our own plantations. So that was sort of a big hit for us in 2015. But 2019, I want to highlight, it was also dry, and yes, there were fires, but if you look at what we managed to do, we managed to reduce that to just over 160 incidences of fire within the estates. And the total hectareage that affected was below 1,000 hectares. And that's pretty significant. So we've reduced it. And the way we've done that is really creating this monitoring going beyond our own operations. And that's illustrated in the picture above. So this is sort of excerpts from our daily fire monitoring that we get from our operations. And the light green, if you can see, the dark green sort of shows where our operations are. So that's our sort of plantations. The light green illustrates the 5 kilometer boundary which we're monitoring as well. And if you can just see, I think the sort of purple dots there, those indicate hot spots. And this is data from NASA that we look at and sort of analyze. So these hotspot reports are delivered on a daily basis to us in operations. And even when there are just hotspots, the idea here is that it becomes therefore the responsibility of operations once they receive a hotspot report to then instruct for a ground check. So then we have to go out, we have to find, even if it's at the edge, if you look at the second picture, that very small dot there, thank you, Ryan, that's at the very edge of the 5 kilometer boundary, but it's still within the boundary. And so you do need to have that checked out. And once we check it out, then confirmation has to be sent back to where we pulled the hotspot data, whether or not that was fire or not. And if it was a fire, then the legal process comes in. We have to report it to the police, record that in, and then take some action, help the communities put it out, etc. And this then results in a closeout report. But this process does make it clear that we have to work with the community outside, right? Because if we don't, the potential therefore is that if that fire is not under control, if there is a fire, then what happens is that's very likely to spread within our operations. And in dry seasons, it's terrible. And once it goes to your operations, it is very catastrophic. I mean, it's equivalent of, let's say, a petroleum company burning an oil well, palm plantations, the fruit is full of oil, it's flammable, the entire area basically will burn. So it is important to really stress that no plantation company in their right mind would be burning their own plantations on purpose, because that's effectively like burning money, and nobody would do that. So the fires that do occur internally tend to come either from a particular area outside and it spreads in, or there's an accidental occurrence within the estate, and that's sort of where how it happens. So if we go to the next slide, please. I think what it highlights here, and I think building on from what Macy had said earlier, is that there is a tendency, I think, to really just look at companies like Wilmar on whether or not they're doing enough. And of course, Wilmar isn't the whole Indonesian industry, and neither is Golden Agri, or neither is Asian Agri. We're all doing our best within sort of the our suppliers as well as our own operational areas. But herein, I think, lies an important element here, is that it is important to look at the smaller companies within the larger supply chain with the sort of what is going to be your minimum criteria. And I often talk about this sustainability pyramid, that if you're looking at palm oil with the pyramid in mind, your RSPO is going to be like that tip, like the pinnacle, right? So it's your best of the best. And if you're really only focusing on that in terms of getting an overall transformation of sustainability for the overall industry, you're never really going to get the numbers going up, because it's tougher and tougher to be the best and to achieve the certification. And so if we really want to look at wholesome transformation of the industry, we're really having to think about increasing the floor of the pyramid. And the only way you can do that is to have minimum requirements, such as a no deforestation, no peat, and no exploitation policy, which is implemented very well and very strictly with all suppliers going into a refining company. And the piece about fire is critical here, because in all companies that have NDPE commitments, no burning is a core here. And so what is happening now is that there's a kind of movement to extend the kind of requirements that are entrenched within the NDPE policies on the smaller companies. So that is moving. I think what will continue to be a source of concern will be companies, and they're not necessarily medium companies, they're sort of companies that are what we like to call the leakage market. So these are companies that also have refining capacity, but they're not selling externally to markets that are requiring NDPE requirements. These are companies that tend to produce, for the local market. For example, in Indonesia is a huge market, and that's where I think the focus needs to be, is on these companies that are selling in either the local market or elsewhere, where they don't really need to have sustainability requirements in place. And so I think the focus really needs to be more on those guys, and not necessarily focus on the sizes, but more about where are they selling. So I think this is, in a nutshell, what we think is the best way to proceed would be to take NDPE as the basis for what you would say is minimum sustainability, which includes, of course, no burning, but then really focus on how that is implemented across the supply chain. I think that's the end of my slides, and I think I will just end there. I'll end with a statement to sort of say the best thing that we can do as consumers is really to choose what you're using. Well, I mean, look for things that can identify as either sustainably produced, and definitely the worst thing that you can do is to boycott palm. Boycotting palm will drive the market towards, something where, its sustainability is not going to be an issue. And that, I think, is something that definitely we don't want to see. Thank you. And I'm sure there'll be interesting questions to follow up with.
Thank you so much, Pat. So next we'll have Benjamin. Over to you.
Sorry, I realized my mic was on mute. Yes, hi everyone. My name is Benjamin. Thanks Pep and Macy for the very good presentations. So PM Haze is a registered charity in Singapore. We were set up, as Ryan mentioned, back in 2014, and we became a registered charity in 2017. We comprise of a governing board, which is a volunteer board, and an executive team that works together with skill-based volunteers as well as advocates from different walks of life in Singapore. Our programs are actually supported by the Singapore Institute of International Affairs, and we've been in partnership with them since 2016 actually. So for today's presentation, I think I will look at three main things and relating to transboundary haze, the causes, the effects, and the solutions. So I guess the biggest question that I always get asked is where does haze come from? Right, I think Macy covered that quite well. So in summary, it basically comes from smoke from forest and land fires in Indonesia. So perhaps just a little some statistics on what happened in 2019. Right, so I think Macy and Pep actually did cover some of the content, but I thought I'd show you guys basically from the research that we've done, secondary research that we've done from the World Resources Institute Global Forest Watch website, that essentially, if you look at this pie chart here, large number of fire alerts actually come from non-concession areas. So that area that you see in orange is actually concession, the areas that are outside of concession areas. And then you see a little breakdown of the fires that the fire alerts that come from other kinds of other types of land areas. For example, pulpwood concessions, logging concessions, as well as palm oil, oil palm concessions. Right, and if you further break down the number in terms of oil palm, you see that there is a very small, small but I guess still significant amount that comes from RSPO plantations, and you break down that figure further, you find that actually 79% of that 0.44% is actually made up of it's actually comes from non-certified RSPO members, and certified RSPO members are about 21%. So the point here is that when the whole entire landscape is on fire, I think it's and especially with all the climate factors and all that, it is inevitably unavoidable that we get fires in various kinds of concessions areas even if it's company concessions, or even if you talk about independent smallholders that may already be adhering to certain sustainability standards on the ground. So it's an issue that's not easy to tackle, definitely. So I think the effects of haze are quite well documented already, but the haze basically has an effect on public health, definitely, especially people with pre-existing conditions, respiratory conditions. There were some small surveys done in Singapore as well, looking at how eateries in Singapore actually see a drop of up to 90% in their patrons during the haze. So that does affect our small and medium-sized businesses in Singapore that involve in F&B. And of course, our migrant worker population who mainly work outdoors, right? They are definitely very heavily affected by transboundary haze in Singapore. And not to forget, most importantly, our friends in Indonesia, as well as Malaysia, right, that actually suffer from annual haze as well, and perhaps in a much larger degree as compared to what we actually experience in Singapore. And of course, in Singapore, we are an urban environment, so we are a lot more adaptable to haze as well. Over in Indonesia, especially if you're going out to rural areas, sometimes adaptation is not really an option for them. So the effects of haze can be very drastic on their health. So causes of haze. This is something that is very difficult to pinpoint, right? As you have all heard so far, right? There's no one cause of haze. There's no one actor that is causing haze. There's no one government that is causing haze, right? It's in a sense this issue is a shared responsibility in that sense. We all share the responsibility of the various effects of haze that we experience on an annual basis. Deforestation is largely found to be perhaps one of the main causes of haze, right? Affecting the climate, affecting the environment. And a lot of this deforestation, I guess a lot of our work focuses on the deforestation of perhaps peatland areas, which Macy mentioned earlier on, are areas that actually tropical rainforest areas that store carbon both above and below ground. So what that means is that carbon is usually stored in your plants and trees, right? But in terms of peatland, carbon is also stored underneath the ground. So from all the dead leaves, dead twigs, branches that fall onto the floor of the forest, this forms layers and layers of peat over time, and this is an accumulation of carbon. So peatlands actually cover about 3% of the Earth's surface, but they store more carbon than all the plants and the trees in the world combined. And interestingly, 70% of peatlands in Southeast Asia are actually found in Indonesia. So roughly you have about 20 million hectares of peatland that are in existence in Indonesia at this moment, mainly concentrated in three main islands, your Sumatra, Kalimantan, as well as Papua. So what are some of the concerns around peat? The thing is that for peatlands to be a useful piece of land for agriculture, you need to drain the peatlands, right? You need to drain it. You need to compact the peat and perhaps put some kind of topsoil on top, things like that, to make it more conducive for dry cropping or dry agricultural methods of different kinds of agricultural produce. Right, so this definitely increases fire risk, especially if the area is not managed well. Right, so going back to Pep's point on how the larger companies actually do have sustainability standards. Not all the companies definitely, but they are definitely in a position to put in more of these sustainability standards. If the area is managed well, I guess there is a possibility that you can reduce the fire risk. But in the sense of it, the usage of peatland for cultivation in general is definitely not a good thing, right? So there's some studies that actually show that 1 hectare of peatland that is degraded, and if it's not managed well, is going to release the equivalent of 3 cars worth of annual carbon dioxide emissions per year. Right, so that is a lot of emissions that you're looking at just on 1 hectare of peatland, right? And if you look at the previous slide that I had, Indonesia has 20 million hectares of peatland. So if you do the math, that's a lot of carbon dioxide that could potentially be put back into the atmosphere and definitely hasten the climate change process. So I guess one of the biggest questions that many of us have is that, you know, is palm oil one of the main causes of haze, right? I think that the cultivation of various kinds of agricultural products definitely have varying degrees of responsibility towards causing environmental problems. And palm oil, unfortunately, has been the focus of many of these a lot of these conversations. But the fact is that palm oil is an efficient oil crop. You know, it's up to 10 times more efficient than other oil crops. Moving away from palm oil will basically just increase the amount of land that you're going to use to grow alternative oil crops. Right. The other thing I think which is important to note as well is that 85% of the global palm oil supply is actually being produced in both Malaysia and Indonesia. You know, which I guess coincidentally are Singapore's neighbors, right? And you know, there is a big, huge impact to the livelihoods of communities in our region. So the palm oil sector in Indonesia and Malaysia, you know, hires, you know, millions of workers across the countries, and you know, livelihoods will definitely be of concern, especially if we're looking at alternative solutions like boycotts, for example. Palm oil is also a very versatile product, so you find palm oil in virtually almost all the products that almost most of the processed edible products that you have in your daily lives. So if you had breakfast this morning and you had your traditional coffee with milk in Singapore, you know, you would have consumed palm oil. If you brush your teeth this morning, I hope everyone brushed their teeth this morning. You would have used palm oil in some way or another, and you know, so it is a product that is in many of our products. Right, 90% of eateries, you know, now that we can go out to restaurants to eat, many of the eateries that we go to, from a survey that we conducted a number of years back, about 90% of these eateries actually use palm oil in their cooking, and a lot of it is actually not certified at the moment, not sustainable at the moment. So I won't go into too much detail on this. I'm mindful of the time that I have. But basically, there is a difference between palm oil that is produced sustainably and palm oil that's produced unsustainably, right? So we look at haze causing kind of methods that are used in various plantations, as well as the haze-free methods, right? So generally, to be sustainable, you have to not use fire, right? That's the number one rule. Working with communities, respecting the rights of workers, ensuring fair wages, that's another thing. Protecting high conservation areas in your concession areas, for example, is another. Protecting the forests and all that is another haze-free or sustainable method. And of course, the thing that we feel strongly about is avoiding actually new planting on peat. And properly manage the water level in existing plantations. I think that's actually very important to have a clear, any kind of sustainability standard for agriculture, we feel, has to have some kind of policy on peatlands, right? Because these are areas that contain so much carbon that, you know, we definitely need to protect the carbon that's in there. And of course, finally, you know, if it does come to a point whereby there are fires in these areas, then you need to have proper fire management protocols in place and firefighting equipment as well to manage these fires. So there are a number of certification standards. This list that I have here is not exhaustive, so there are other certification standards out there as well. But many of the certification standards, with the exception of the RSPO, actually only cover kind of upstream supply chain. So which means that they might cover, say, producers as well as the mills, but they don't go downstream into, for example, your suppliers of palm oil to your F&B restaurants, or even at the caterer level, for example, which I know RSPO has been exploring in the last recent years. So the MSPO and the ISPO are perhaps two standards that most of us may be familiar with if you are familiar with the issue. So the MSPO is the Malaysian Sustainable Palm Oil, and the ISPO is Indonesian Sustainable Palm Oil, which are both mandatory standards. But like I mentioned, only cover upstream supply chain actors. For us, we focus a little bit more on RSPO because there is an avenue for us to relate this to consumers, right? Because the RSPO has a trademark, for example, that that is identifiable on products, for example. They do certify the FMCG actors in the supply chain, which makes it easier for consumers when you go to the supermarket to buy a product, for example. Right, and the other thing is that there have been a lot of studies that actually show that RSPO does have robust principles and criteria that offer more protection for biodiversity. Right, and we're not saying here that RSPO is the perfect or the be all end all of certification standards in the world, right? But I think the RSPO is what the best we have at the moment. So and it's an association that actually amalgamates both actors from the private sector as well as from the non-profit sectors, and there is an I guess a sufficient voice from these sectors, right, to be able to ensure that this certification system is holistic. The RSP also recently launched an independent smallholder standard in 2019, which covers a lot of the independent smallholder plantation methods and all that. So that's actually very important, because like we showed before this, right, is that plantations or farmers on the ground require a lot of support in order to make their plantations more to progress their plantations from something that's maybe perhaps not as sustainable to a model that's a bit more sustainable in the future. So solutions to haze, I won't go into detail on this, but Macy talked about this already. So there has been policies from the Indonesian government. So it's not that the Indonesian government has not been doing anything. We have to understand that Indonesia is a very, 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 very big country, right? Compared to Singapore, for example. So many of us live in Singapore, and we maybe perhaps do not appreciate the size or the geography of Indonesia itself. So these policies are not easy to enforce, right? Because we have various political or I guess boundaries within local kind of regional boundaries within Indonesia that are managed by the provinces themselves, the districts, the regency, So these are not easy policies to be able to be enforced on the ground, right? But I think from a policy level, Indonesia is doing well in terms of ensuring that there is a top line policy that prevents the clearing of forests, for example, as well as preventing the over exploitation of peatland areas. Coming to Singapore, we have our own solutions as well from a Singapore government perspective. So the Transboundary Haze Pollution Act was enacted in 2014, and what that essentially entailed is that companies that are set up in Singapore that have operations in Indonesia can potentially be prosecuted under this particular act. Right, so that's the short of it, right? So there are a lot of criteria that actually enable the government to actually charge a company or successfully prosecute a company. But to this day, there has been no successful prosecutions from the Singapore government. And on top of that, I think that this policy has been largely seen to be something that is not perhaps as collaborative as it should be, in the sense that we don't necessarily work with the Indonesian government to ensure that there are some kind of policy overlaps or even overlaps in terms of their policy objectives when it comes to going after the errant companies on the ground. Right. The other thing is that I think there has been a lot of criticism that this act may not be so effective, but I think that there is some success in the act, in the sense that it does act as a symbolic deterrent. Because companies do know, a lot of companies that are operating in Indonesia actually have their headquarters in Singapore, so they do know that this is definitely a deterrent for them, right? And there was actually such a company. There was a large pulp and paper company in Singapore that was actually found to have caused haze, right? They went through the entire process, and I must say that at least even though they weren't prosecuted, but I think they did improve their practices over time, so that really counts for something in that sense. They did improve their fire management and fire prevention practices, and they're also engaging a lot of meaningful work in terms of peatland research and all that. So I think there is a good side to this, right? But how do we make this better going forward? I think that's something that we all need to work together with the regional governments. Another top-down approach that we employed, not necessarily from the government, is that I mentioned that the pulp and paper company had their green label actually taken away from them. and that resulted in our local supermarket actually withdrawing all the products sourced from this particular firm that was contributing to haze. And it was essentially a boycott, right? But I mean, a boycott of perhaps one company could be sustainable, but a boycott of all pulp and paper products in the world, that might not be so sustainable. So I think it's an approach that has its merits, but also has its limitations. So our advocacy program, PM Haze's advocacy program, largely looks at three main things, right? One is about building knowledge, community participation, as well as taking action. In terms of building knowledge, we are members, and we are affiliated to various associations globally. And the Fire Free Alliance is one of them. The RSPO, we're members of the RSPO, and we are also associate members of SASPO, which is an association that was set up by the WWF in Singapore. So I think essentially these associations are a way for us to gain knowledge and build capacity with various actors in the supply chain, right? In the palm oil supply chain especially, to actually understand better about what's going on in the wider scheme of things. We have run campaigns. We have been running campaigns since 2015. Our first ever campaign was a collaboration with WWF and the SWIA. It was called "We Breathe What We Buy," and that was really the first. Consumer targeted campaign in Singapore that looked at solutions that everyday people living in Singapore can take when it comes to haze. We hold roadshows and talks. We do outreach, physical outreach. Although in the COVID situation now, that's not really possible, right? But we are definitely shifting to a more online model. Media engagement as well. I think we do engage as well as help to educate various parties in the media as well to help people to help reach out to more people in Singapore as well as in the region about our programs and our cause. Community participation, we hold community events. So we do talks like these, for example, like this particular webinar, as well as hold events where people can actually go down to the ground and actually find out for themselves what they can actually do to prevent haze. We work very closely with youth in Singapore, especially students in our tertiary institutions. So these are some of the examples of projects that we have done. We work with youth across various educational institutions in Singapore. One of the ongoing projects is actually an interesting one. So we are actually working with some students they are actually applying for a grant to actually close the loop in palm oil use in Singapore. So they're not only looking at sustainable palm oil, but they're looking at some of the initiatives of recycling of the cooking oil tins among F&B establishments in Singapore as well. In order to find a way to increase that sustainability of the F&B sector. We've worked with both NTU and NUS on a campaign that aspires to create a haze-free campus. So in the NUS at the moment, we are actually in conversation with the NUS management to convert most of their canteen vendors to using sustainable palm oil. So that's still a work in progress at the moment. And finally, taking action. I think the three main principles we live by is, reduce consumption of palm oil, definitely, or any other agricultural product that may be grown in our region. Choose haze-free, choose more responsibly sourced or more responsibly produced products, as well as, do your part and advocate for the issue. So there are already some haze-free eateries that we can actually visit in Singapore. So these are some examples of them. So if you like your curry puffs, I hear there was a new curry puff launched by Old Chang Kee today. So you might want to go try it. It's made with sustainable palm oil. And some of the other restaurants here also serve food using a sustainable cooking oil. We hold what we call a Go Haze Free event, where we actually bring our program to people living in a particular community. For example, this particular one in the picture was actually done in Tiong Bahru. So we went out to all the different establishments in Tiong Bahru as an opportunity for volunteers to actually find out, for themselves, what are the challenges that actually restaurants face when they are talking about using using cooking oil, as well as what the challenges they face in terms of wanting to switch to cooking oil. So we do hold events like this, and if any of you are interested, we are happy to actually tailor some of these programs as well, whether in the online or offline format. I think it's actually a fun way for people to understand more about the issue, and of course to go out there and to go out there to F&B establishments. I mean, food is one of the favorite pastimes of people in Singapore. So that has always been popular. That has always been popular. We attempt to deepen the understanding of people living in Singapore on the rural sustainability issues that people face in our region as well. So we actually have a partnership with Muslim Aid in Malaysia, where we bring people in living in Singapore to a peat swamp forest reserve in Air Hitam. So that's just actually north of Johor Bahru. The trip is a quick one. I mean, we can get in and out within 2 days and 1 night, or even 3 days and 2 nights, depending on what the needs of our participants are. Right. So we really want people to understand what is peatland management, what is sustainable peatland management, and to also get people to really directly be involved in peatland conservation itself through the planting of native peat swamp forest trees within that particular forest reserve. Okay, last but not least, we have a community-managed peatland restoration program, which we just kicked off in 2019. And this particular program is actually in Sungai Tohor village, which is in Meranti Regency in Riau province. So it's a stone's throw away from Singapore. It takes a couple hours to get there, but it's actually not that far. It's just that, there's a lot of waiting time and there's a lot of transits and all that. But essentially, we get there from Batam. I haven't been there in a while because of this situation. But we work very closely with the community there, essentially to achieve reduce fire and haze risk through peatland restoration. We want to create a community-centric peatland restoration model that can be effected by the community, right? So nothing too fancy, no fancy scientific equipment or things like that. We really want something that the community can actually use and can actually implement on their own. And of course, I think that this is symbolically can help us to increase collaboration among our two countries as well, as well as among all the regional stakeholders that are involved in peatland restoration. So these are some of the people that are actually on our project at the moment. Azari Ahmad, he's actually from Medan, so he's actually our program coordinator at the moment. He helps to facilitate the work with our community. And Yuki, she's actually an undergraduate that has been part-time with us, doing a lot of the research work with regards to peatland restoration. We aspire to develop a holistic restoration program on community-owned land. So we do revegetation of native peat swamp forest trees, as well as providing incentives through paludi culture, so sago palm trees as well on the same piece of land. So we don't buy the land from the community, or we don't rent the land from the community. What we do is that we educate people about the value of their land, and then we go there and we have an arrangement with them that if you, I'll put it simply, right? So if you grow trees on land that is degraded in your that you own, then in return we'll provide you with some incentives. So some of the incentives can be we'll provide seedlings for sago seedlings for them to be able to harvest in the future, harvest sustainably, as well as some other and support them through some of the products, like for example sago noodles that can be made from sago flour, as well as some other sago products that can be produced from sago flour. Right, so at the heart of our program is really about community development, right? So it's ecological restoration, but it's also about motivating people to be able to contribute contribute this ecological restoration from their community and within their community. So we do a lot of educational programs with them. We work with the schools in the local areas, the village schools in the area. We also hold kind of mass events within the village to get a wider audience and get a wider understanding of what the work we're doing over there. And actually something that we just kicked off recently was actually a kind of small kind of agricultural program where we provide seeds to various people within the community, because vegetable prices and seeds prices have gone up quite a bit this year due to COVID. And in return, we're actually helping to teach them about composting, about using methods that don't use fire, how do you plant more sustainably on your own kind of land within their village areas. Right, so this is our program strategy. I'm happy to elaborate more, but essentially it's a restoration of vegetation cover, restoration of hydrology through the building of canal blocks, as well as what I mentioned, community development. We currently have some research collaborations. So with the University of Newcastle, we are actually looking at a project where we are looking at a guided restoration of community managed peatlands. That's kind of a general topic. We haven't zoomed into the exact topic as yet. Because there have been a lot of delays to the field work and things like that. So we are in the middle of rejigging that at the moment. With the Nanyang Technological University as well, been working with, I think Prof. Janice is actually on the call at the moment. We're actually providing them with a platform to understand better about the restoration work that we do in Sungai Tohor as part of the project that that's funded by the MOE grant. We have also tried to relate this better to audiences in Singapore through a peatland adoption, peatland tree adoption program. When we were able to do roadshows, we actually basically had an adoption program whereby people can donate $5 and that will actually adopt 2 trees in our nursery, and these trees will eventually be transplanted onto degraded peatland areas in Sungai Tohor. So what's coming up? I'm excited to say that you see some new faces on the call that haven't been talking, right? So these are actually our interns that are with us for the summer, and they'll be continuing with us actually after the summer on a part-time basis. So they've been hard at work at developing a supermarket guide in Singapore. So I think what we want to do is that we want to have a comprehensive guide into edible and non-edible products that contain sustainable palm oil that are available in supermarkets locally. They will include products that have the RSPO trademark, as well as the ones that don't have the RSPO trademark, right? Because there is a way that we can actually go onto the RSPO website to understand whether a company is using sustainable palm oil or not in their products. So we have done a lot of that background research and put it into and basically identify products in our supermarkets that may or may not have the trademark but are using sustainable palm oil within their products. So I think this is an effort for us to want to make going haze-free actually accessible to everyone in Singapore. And finally, we are happy to announce that we are actually in collaboration with the David and Lucille Packard Foundation, where we are going to kick off a campaign this year on the education of haze-free palm oil in Singapore, as well as engaging food establishments in Singapore to switch to haze-free palm oil. And finally, look at how do we actually publicly assure this commitment. We are looking into an auditing framework that will be able to track their commitments as well as communicate these commitments to our supporters online. Yep. So thank you very much. Sorry, I went a little bit over time. Yep.
Okay.